introduction and for, oh, okay, just going to accept that. Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to present my research today. So as Daniel already said, I will be talking about my PhD research on social identity switching. And switching between social identities is really something we do on an everyday basis. So it might be switching from who we are as part of a work group to maybe our identity as a parent or an identity that we share with our friendship group, for example. And in a nutshell, what my PhD focused on is the question of how good are we at switching between different social identities, and do we have any control over social identity switches? And that's also what I want to talk about today. I'm going to minimize this. Okay. So because we've got a bit of time today, I actually have the pleasure to be talking about quite a few of the studies that I ran as part of my PhD. So first of all, I wanted to present 3 studies on the effectiveness of social identity switches that we recently published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. And then 2 newer studies on control over social identity switches that we're just currently writing up. So it will be great to get your feedback on that as well. Okay, but first of all, what are social identities? I think I'm not telling you anything new there. So social identities are, in a nutshell, who we are based on our different group and category memberships. And importantly, the surrounding can make different identities salient. So if you're walking into a football stadium, it's likely going to be your sports supporter identity. If you're walking into work, it's likely going to be the social identity that you share with your work group. And importantly, we know that depending on which identity is currently salient, this can really affect how we perceive the world around us. And that ranges from our decision-making to how we treat people based on whether they're in-group or out-group members, or even there was an interesting study on food pleasantness ratings. So even how we rate food pleasantness can differ depending on which identity is active. So social identity switches truly are an important part of our daily life, but we don't know that much about them. So self-categorization theory states that social identity switches are inherently variable, fluid, and context-dependent. So that sounds quite automatic, as if we're sort of just adjusting to our surrounding, but this hasn't really been tested empirically. So we wanted to know whether switching social identities comes with any types of costs. So that could be, for example, a delay in activating the identity that we're switching towards. And in our research, we call this social identity activation costs. As I already said, we didn't find that much in the social identity literature on the actual potentially costs of switching. So we turned to a different research area, and that's task switching. And hopefully, in the next couple of minutes, I can show you why it's really interesting to compare task switching and identity switching. So what happens in a task switching experiment? So you would ask participants to perform relatively simple tasks. So that could be naming the color of an object versus the shape of an object. And then within subject design, you ask participants to either keep repeating the same task or to switch between tasks. And you have lots and lots of trials so that in the end, you can truly compare, repeat, and switch trials. And what has been found over and over again is that switching is costly. So you become slower and you make more errors if you have to switch tasks as compared to repeating tasks. Now you might say, okay, that's great, but what does that have to do with social identities? Because clearly it's something different. So a social identity switch is not the same as a task switch. You might, for example, you might keep completing the same task. You might write an email, but in the meantime, you might switch social identities. So where do we see a link there? This really comes in when we look at factors that might explain task switch costs. One of those factors is task set reconfiguration. And my favorite explanation of it is that it's like a mental gear change. So if you want to switch tasks, you have to inhibition all types of elements or rules that you learned in line with the prior task, and you have to activate all types of elements attached to the new task. And if we now think about identities, something quite similar might happen. So clearly we know that social identities differ in a lot of attributes. So that might be different goals depending on which identity is salient, different stimuli that you might be paying more or less attention to. And if you want to switch from one identity to another, that would also mean having to inhibition all of those elements of the old identity and having to activate elements of the identity you're switching towards. And that could potentially lead to a delay. A second factor is task set inertia, and that's a carryover effect of the previous task. So it's involuntary, and it means that the previous task basically remains primed and interferes with the task you're trying to switch to. And again, there's a link to social identities. So we might say, if there's an identity that's almost chronically salient or very strongly salient for whatever reason it might be, this identity might interfere with the switch. So it might remain active even though you would normally switch over to another identity. And again, that could result in those identity activation costs. So hopefully by now I have you convinced that it's very much worth looking over to task switching research and looking at what switch costs might look like. And this is what we also tried to address in our first study. So we wanted to know, are social identity switches as highly effective and as automatic as, for example, indicated by self-categorization theory, or are there any type of costs, so what we call social identity activation costs? The first hurdle that we had to overcome is that we had to assess salience, and that's always a bit of a tricky task. Of course, we could have just asked participants, hey, which identity is active in your mind in this very moment? But as you might have found, maybe even with your own research, self-reports don't tend to work that well with assessing identity salience. It's much better to actually use an implicit measure because participants might simply not be able to comment on which identity is currently salient in their mind. So we tried a couple of implicit measures, and the one that we ended up using for our first study is the IAT. And what we did in IAT is that we inferred which identity is currently active from in-group bias. In-group bias can be assessed with the typical congruency effect that you find in an IAT. And that is that participants will be asked to basically sort images and words, and it's images of in or out group members. And in-group bias-wise, you would expect that participants are quicker and make less errors if the in-group is mapped on the same side as good words and the out-group is mapped on the same side as bad words. Versus we would expect that there would be more errors and slower responses if, for example, in-group faces are mapped on the same side as bad words. So we are assessing in-group bias, and from this in-group bias, we're then inferring that okay, if someone is showing this bias, that specific identity must be salient. Okay, so what did the study look like? We had quite a couple of IATs. We started with a couple of practice runs. We then had one block 0 that was simply that we needed one starting point. So one identity we made salient at the start, so we knew where participants are switching from. And then at the heart of the study were 4 main IATs and then a questionnaire at the end. And we very much stick to how a study that looks at switch costs would be run in task switching research. So it was a within subject design, and every participant completed 2 identity repeats and 2 identity switches, so that we could then very directly compare how effective is repeating the same identity as compared to switching between identities. So our independent variables were switching, so that participants have to switch identities or stay in the same one, and the congruency effect, which we use to infer identity salience. And then the dependent variables were again very much in line with task switching research, the reaction times and error rates. We tested 64 participants, which might not sound much, but because we had multiple observations, that was actually well powered for the study. And then we looked at our main hypothesis, which was which looked at how effective switches actually are. And bear with me, I'm just quickly going to walk you through the result patterns that we would expect if there were switch costs or if there weren't any switch costs, just to unravel that a little bit. So those are not our actual results yet. So the alternative hypothesis would be that if there are identity activation costs, we would expect that the congruency effect, so identity salience, is reduced after a switch. So that means that you just switched over towards that next identity, and it might not quite be salient yet. So you can see this over here, that in switch trials, you would then expect this reduced difference between congruent and incongruent trials. Whereas in repeat trials, where you've been in this identity for quite a while now, we would expect a strong congruency effect. So a bigger difference between congruent and incongruent trials. And that would be both in reaction times and error rates. Or if there are no costs to switching, we would expect the pattern of results to look like this. So that basically the congruency effect would be present, but it would be very much similar or would not differ depending on whether you just switched identities or whether you stayed in the same identity. So basically showing that no matter you're switching or staying in the same identity, this identity is always strongly salient. Okay, and this is what we actually found. So for the reaction times, I think it very quickly becomes visible that we did not find the interaction. So we found no support for any identity activation costs. It becomes a bit more interesting when we look at the error rates, because there is a significant interaction, but it's in the opposite direction. So in this case, we see that in repeat trials, so where participants were in the same identity for quite a while, we have a reduced congruency effect. And in switch trials, where they just switched over to this identity, we have a stronger congruency effect, which is really interesting. At the very least, it tells us that there weren't any costs to switching. It might indicate, and that's something I want to look at in the future, that maybe there's even benefits to switching. So it could be that salience wears off after a while and switching might almost reactivate the identity. But that's for now an educated guess. That would be something we would have to look into a little bit more. So at the very least, it tells us that switches were effective in the sense of there was no cost to switching. Okay, so study one supports highly effective social identity switches, but we could by no means generalize this to all types of identities. So what might, for example, happen is that if we look at different types of identities that are, for example, not as compatible or differ, we might find some form of cost. And we took a first step in our second and third study to address this issue. We started to focus on novel versus established identities, coming from the idea of that it is an important part of our life to form novel group memberships. And we know that finding more meaningful group memberships can be very beneficial for us. So we wanted to know that whether there might be some costs in the very early stages of integrating this identity into your self-concept, where maybe identity switches might jar a little bit and might not be as automatic. Okay, you might ask yourself, okay, why would I expect novel identities to not be as effective in the switching context? We have two theories that would speak towards that. One is social self-regulation theory, which basically says that if a group is made salient for the very first time, as you would have, for example, in a minimal group paradigm, where you tell participants, okay, you're now all of a sudden part of the blue or red team. In this case, self-defining processes take some time, so they take some conscious processing. It's not automatic yet. But the more often you make this identity salient, the process will become more automated. So in our first study, we, for example, included participants' age identity, and that should be quite a well-established identity. For most participants, that identity would be activated quite often. So we would expect it to be automatic. Whereas if we now include a minimal group identity, we could say, okay, maybe in this case, the switching process might jar a little bit. This also goes in line with a model by Amiet and colleagues, which proposes 4 stages of how we integrate novel identities into the self concept. And it starts out with the first couple of stages where identities are rather anticipatory or not integrated with any other identities yet, up to the 4th stage where an identity is very well integrated with all of the other identities, and simultaneous activation of identities might even be possible. So also based on this model, we could say a minimal group identity that you have by no means integrated with your existing identities yet might be more difficult in a switching context than an identity that's well integrated into your self-concept. So based on all of that, we said that we would expect switches from established identities to be more effective, and we would expect it to be less effective if a switch involves a novel identity. Okay, our design was similar. We used IATs again, and again, we had a within subject design, but this time we had 2 different types of switches. So one was the novel identity switch, where we asked participants to, or where we prompted them to switch from a minimal group identity to an age identity, the age identity being a well-established one. And then another switch where participants switched between their national and age identity. So 2 well-established identities that should be well integrated into the self-concept. We then balanced the order between participants. Another important change that we made in the second study is that we used a different type of IAT. So you might have already noticed that in our first study, we relied quite heavily on in-group bias, and we might not actually see in-group bias with all social identities. So we did find it with the ones that we tested, but for example, if you have a stigmatized group, you might not find this typical in-group bias. So we wanted a measure that relies less on balance and assesses self-categorization more directly. We did this with the identification IAT, and the only change is really that rather than using good and bad words, this IAT uses self versus other words. So it assesses self-categorization directly. And we tested 48 participants in this study. We did look at the precondition, whether we would find a main congruency effect. That's important because we had this minimal group induction, and we wanted to know whether it actually worked. So did participants actually identify with the blue team, which they were allocated to, and that all worked fine. So we can see that both for the national identity and the minimal group identity, we found a strong main congruency effect. So showing that people associated in-group faces with self-related words. We then looked at a comparison between switching from novel versus established identities. And again, I'm just going to show you the expected turn of results first, just to make it a bit clearer. So those are, again, not our actual results. That's what we expected. So we said we would think that switching from a novel identity would make the switch less efficient. So this would be over here on the left. So we would expect a smaller congruency effect. And switching between 2 established identities should be quite effective, similar to the first study. So we would expect this relatively large congruency effect. And this is what we found. So there was no significant interaction in either reaction times or error rates. So the switch was similarly effective, both for novel and established identities. So indeed, novel identities seem to be very quickly either integrated into the self or at least not interfering with the switching process. We then reran this as a registered report with an increased sample size. This time we tested 144 participants, and you can also very nicely see how the results become a little bit clearer here. So there's definitely no interaction. We could then also run a Bayesian analysis. So we found strong support for the null hypothesis, saying that there's no significant difference between switching from a novel or from an established identity. Okay, so what could we conclude based on those first 3 studies? So first of all, social identity switches seem to be highly effective. So we could not find any identity activation costs. Interestingly, we also looked at switch costs in those specific studies, and we did find switch costs. So we know the paradigm was working, but just that the social identities did not come with any costs. And we then also found that switches from novel identities are not less effective than switches away from an established identity. We came up with some ideas for future research. So first of all, we still want to rerun those studies with other types of identities. So for example, incompatible identities, because maybe that's when we start to experience some costs. We made a start at looking into cross-categorizations. That would be the idea that maybe participants didn't really switch, but at least for some time, they might have kept both identities active concurrently. We had slightly inconclusive results on this. So this is something that we wanted to run again as well. And then based on those studies, we also had the question of, well, can we actually control social identity switches? So especially if we think about social identity switches being that highly effective, do we have any say in when we switch between social identities, or is it just something that's triggered by our environment, and whether we want to or not, we're going to switch? And this leads over to the last 2 studies that I wanted to talk about, and they're on control over social identity switches. I'm just going to very quickly pause because I know it's a lot of different studies, just to double check whether anyone already has any questions on the first 3 studies or anything I should clarify. All good? Okay, then I keep going. Perfect. Okay, so you might ask yourself, well, that's great, but why would I want to control social identity switches? You just told me it's this highly effective process. Isn't this great? Why does it need controlling? There are a lot of different scenarios where we might need control over social identity switches. And one that we might have all more or less experienced over the last couple of years is when we're, for example, working from home during COVID lockdowns. So it might be that we have to perform a specific task that one identity is beneficial for. So say you might want to write a work email, and obviously it's better if you stay in your academic identity because you don't want to start using the same terms that you explain things to your children in your work email. So you might want to prevent switching away from this one specific identity. And as you can see over here in this image, a lot of the times, many things are happening in our home life that might make us switch very rapidly. And it might be beneficial to be able to stay in one identity. So it is highly relevant, obviously, during the COVID-19 restrictions, but very much not limited to that. It could be, for example, that you're doing online banking and you see some ads pop up on the site, and that might draw you away from a specific identity when actually you want to be not in some form of risk-taking identity. You actually want to stay in a risk-averse identity to complete your online banking. So there's lots of different scenarios where we can think about wanting to stay in this one identity. So this led to our research question of, can we prevent social identity switches when we want to or when we have to? Okay, so we ran a study with 185 participants where we started out with making one identity salient. In this case, it was participants' parent identity. We just did this with a 3 things manipulation. And then we split participants into two groups. We had a control group that we just told, you now have a writing task come up. And then we had an experimental group that we actually told for the next part of the study, it is important that you try and keep thinking of yourself as a parent. So lay terms for, please try to stay in your parent identity and avoid a social identity switch. And we then triggered a social identity switch. So we asked participants to write about a topic that's strongly related to their feminist identity. So in this case, it was objectification of women that we asked them to write about. And we just said, okay, write 3 to 5 sentences about this topic. And we knew that normally this should trigger a switch away from the parent identity towards their feminist identity. And then we had some demographic questionnaires at the end. We assessed salience in 2 different ways. So again, because I'm not a big fan of self-report items at all, we included an implicit measure. And that was a linguistic style measure. It's called Azure. It's a really interesting paper actually by my supervisor, Miriam, in 2021. So it's based on classifiers that are trained on forum data to distinguish between 2 different identities. That also explains why we looked at the parent and feminist identity. We just know that the classifiers are trained on this and they can really distinguish between them quite well. And we then just analyzed those 3 to 5 sentences that participants wrote, and we could tell, are they more in their parent identity or more in their feminist identity? And then we also included a good old self-report, which we asked right after the parent identity was made salient and right after the main writing task. So we just asked participants write out, how strongly are you thinking of yourself as a parent right now? Okay, so I'm going to start with the self-report. So what would we expect if people can prevent social identity switches? So if they can prevent the switch away from their parent identity, we would expect a weaker decrease in salience of the parent identity in the experimental group, and we would expect a stronger decrease in the control condition because they were not asked to avoid the switch, so they should have really switched over to their feminist identity. But this is what we found. So, well, I didn't really want to zoom in, but it was significant that participants did decrease on the overall salience of the parent identity. But we found no significant difference between the experimental group and control group. So no support for participants in the experimental group that they were able to prevent this. And we then looked at the linguistic styles, or implicit measure. And there we would expect that if participants in the experimental group were able to prevent the switch, we would still find more of a parental linguistic style in what they've written. And for the control condition, we would have expected them to switch over. So we would expect to find more of a feminist linguistic style. Just as a quick background explanation, the linguistic style analysis always compares 2 identities. So in this case, it compares the feminist and parent identity. And a score of 0 would mean, okay, it's definitely the feminist identity. A score of 1 would mean it's the parent identity. And the score of 0.5 would mean classifier can't really tell us. Okay, so this is what we found. And so this is now the probability that the feminist identity is salient. So one would be that the parent identity is salient, 0 that the feminist identity is salient. And again, we found no significant difference between the experimental group and control group. But then it got really interesting when we reran the study and we added an incentive. So a thought was that maybe in this previous study, the prompt was just not strong enough, because all we really did is we told participants, please try to stay in your parent identity. They could have overlooked this. They could have not taken the sentence very serious. So we thought, okay, we have to up our game a little bit. We have to really motivate them to try and stay in their parent identity. So we added a bonus payment. We told them, if you manage to stay in your parent identity, we can tell which identity you're in, you will receive a bonus payment. And now all of a sudden we found this for the explicit measure, which is really interesting. So in the control group, we find the drop-off that we would expect, so that obviously the parent identity decreases, the salience of the parent identity. But in the experimental group, participants are now telling us, no, actually, my parent identity is still salient. So I was able to prevent this switch. That's what participants are telling us. This is what we found in the implicit measure. So again, in the implicit measure, we actually found no significant difference between the two groups. So even though in the self-report participants say, yes, I was able to prevent the switch in the sense of the parent identity is still salient, we then see in the implicit measure that there's no significant difference between the two groups. So what did we conclude based on this? So first of all, people seem to have limited control over social identity switches. And that is even when they are motivated to prevent the switch and might even think or report that they are able to do so. So that's what we saw in the second study, where participants told us, yes, I was able to keep my parent identity salient, but we then didn't see this in the implicit measure. Concerning practical implications, this can tell us quite a bit about our ability to manage multiple identities. And in the next step, it might also help us to find ways to improve people's work-life balance, or to maybe even help them to gain some control over social identity switches. But it's obviously still a starting point. So there's a lot of interesting future directions. As a starting point, we'd like to look at different identities. So for example, at participants' parent and work identity, or really any type of identities we can train our classifiers on. And then we're, for example, also interested in individual differences. So do we find some people that can control social identity switches, whereas other people might really struggle with it? So looking into this and then maybe learning something from people that can control social identity switches really well to see whether we can help other people to improve this level of control. Okay, so as an overall conclusion, I know those were a lot of studies and a lot of information, but we talked about the first 3 studies that basically support that social identity switches are effective. We're really good at switching social identities, and we could not find any costs. But as a potential flip side to that coin, we also found that we have limited control over social identity switches. So if an identity switch is triggered by our surrounding, we might switch over even if we don't want to. Okay, that was everything from me. A big thank you to my supervisors. That's Miriam Koschate-Reis, Aurelio Lavbrick, and Mark Levin. And if you're interested, especially in this social identity linguistic style measure, you can have a look at this blog over here, where we're talking about a bit more research that we did with this. And I'm looking forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Anna. That was great. So does anyone have any questions for Anna?
I can go first if you like. Sorry, I disappeared for a little bit there, Anna. I had unexplained internet problems, but so you may have answered this question and I just missed it in the bit I was out for. But I'm kind of interested in implications around things like stereotype threat, because there's been this research basically suggesting that it's a very robust phenomenon, but we haven't really got a good idea of why it exists, right? Like there are lots of different mediators that have been proposed, and I don't think there's a lot of consistency there. But one of the things I'm thinking about is part of what you're showing really that it doesn't matter if people try not to let it affect them, like if you remind me of the stereotype of like, I don't know, women being bad at lifting heavy objects, and then I try not to think of myself as a woman while I'm doing weightlifting, that doesn't help. I still am, right? I can't just unhook from that. Do you think that that's kind of part of what might be going on there?
Yes, definitely, with sort of triggers in our surrounding, that even if we don't want to switch, as you said, we might still switch over. And also it would be interesting with stereotype threat, all the way at the start of the presentation, I talked about how in task switching, you have this task set inertia where a previous task basically still lingers. And you might have that with identities if they experienced stereotype threat potentially, that you can't quite switch away from that identity.
Yeah, that's really
that would be really interesting to look into, actually.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Anna?
I just want to say that was a really interesting talk. It was good to think about, or rather be reminded of measures that aren't self-report measures, because I'm pretty guilty of only using those so far in my PhD. So it's definitely something I'll be considering moving forward. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Did anyone else have any questions or comments? So I guess I might jump in and just ask a question that I did actually ask you in your Viva, just about sort of more like the underlying processes. So you talked about salience just in general. So how do you think things like perceiver readiness, comparative fit, those kind of things might impact switches in various ways?
I think we have to run a study on that. And I know we're sort of planning something there anyway, but so it would be interesting because perceiver readiness obviously includes, for example, goals. So when we think about preventing a switch, perceiver readiness would in a way speak towards that, so towards staying in one specific identity. But based on what I'm finding, it might almost be that if it is triggered in the surroundings, that might be meta contrast, we just switch over. So based on this, we might actually have quite an interesting paradigm to pick apart what type of process really drives a switch. So is it perceiver readiness in the end? Is it normative fit, comparative fit?
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions they wanted to ask Anna?
I just jumping. I just have like a general comment, I guess. I think this is definitely very fascinating research. And I think this really speaks to the idea of this fluidity of self, right? Like it doesn't, I think in the current, people outside of social identity theory might not think of self as this fluid. They might have a more self as being more stable over time. So I'm coming from more of a social norm literature, and then we're struggling a lot over there as well with this kind of norm work, is that people consistently think things are very stable, they don't change over time. But I think your research is demonstrating very well the fact that we do actually change quite fluidly from one identity to the other, and then and it is the case that we're dealing with a paradigm shift where we have to consider self as being very much changeable, and then there's fluidity to it. And I guess also I was thinking about comparative fit, normative fit as well. So I think it's definitely fascinating research to look forward to in your future studies. Definitely very interested to see what you find. Thanks.
Thank you. On what you said with how surprising it is in a way, how seamlessly we switch. I definitely had that surprise moment when the results from the first couple of studies came in, and I almost expected that to be some form of costs, especially after what I read with task switching literature. I thought clearly there's going to be costs to switching social identities, and it was really surprising and interesting to see that even when we then added in novel identities, it just remained this seamless switch that people completed. And it really speaks to ourselves just adapting quite automatically.
I can ask another question. No, Sam, you go. I'm not going to hog the floor.
I mean, I'm not a social identity researcher, so I might have a really silly question, but I wondered if there are different results for people who see the identity as more important, so have a stronger social identification.
So we did control for strength of identification, so where you basically ask participants, how strongly do you identify, for example, as a parent? We didn't really find much of a difference there, but that would be also interesting to maybe, because I guess all of the identities that we have were ones that participants identified reasonably strongly with. So it would be interesting to actually compare it with one that I didn't identify much with. So there's again a bit of leeway where we could maybe compare something.
Tegan, did you want to ask your question?
If we have time, I'll jump in. And this is maybe a more kind of a measurement question for you, Anna, but I think it has theoretical implications, which is that, so, you know, as I've used, and quite a few of us have done work looking at multiple group memberships. So measuring or manipulating people's perception that they are involved and have sort of social identities across multiple groups that are as a resource to them. I'm just thinking about, like, so one of the ways we've experimented and manipulated that, for instance, is that we ask people to kind of name and then reflect on several groups. So we've used that with as many as 5, but more commonly like 3 group memberships at a time. What do you think's going on psychologically there if someone is asked about sort of 3 groups like that in quick succession, and then we see benefits about them being asked about multiple groups, right? So are they rapidly switching between multiple? Are we indeed making multiple groups salient at the same time? What's happening?
That's a super interesting question, because I guess we almost have different theories, right? So if we base it on functional antagonism, we would be very rapidly switching, because we could always just have one identity salient. And we found some support for that. So that's sort of where I said we looked into cross-categorization and we had a bit of mixed findings. So in our first studies, we found no support for it. So that would say people actually did switch. We did find a little bit of support for cross-categorization in the studies with the minimal group, but that could have been influenced by a training session that they had. So overall, I would say, especially if you make more than 2 identities salient at the same time, I would expect it's actually switching, because I guess you reach a limit at some point of how many identities you can keep salient in your mind at one point. Why it's actually, I mean, with the positive outcomes, there is some research even on how creativity might be affected by switching between identities. And I guess if you complete those rapid switches and they're not costly, you can potentially harness benefits of different group memberships. So
yeah, good answer. There's a lot to think about there, I think.
Thank you. So I think we probably should wrap up now. So thank you again, Anna, for a great presentation. Again, very interesting research. You know that I love it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Just a quick sort of thing just to finalize for today. So just to note that when we do this in person, we're hoping also to be able to go and get a drink afterwards. So obviously not today, not the next one, but hopefully the one after that, there'll be an opportunity to actually get drinks together if we can after that. So I'll just leave it at that for today. So thank you. Thanks everyone. And thanks again, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you for organizing this, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye.